People think that when a police officer walks up and casually taps your taillight during a traffic stop, it's just a habit, maybe even something out of a training manual that doesn't really matter. That assumption is exactly where things start to go wrong. Because that small, almost forgettable moment, the sound of a knuckle against plastic as you sit there with your hands on the wheel, is not random. It's not meaningless. And in the world I've spent years in, reviewing body camera footage frame by frame, reading transcripts where every word gets dissected, watching cases rise and fall on tiny details, that tap can quietly shape everything that happens next. So let me give you the one phrase that matters more than anything else in that moment. The one thing you need to anchor yourself to before the conversation starts to drift, before the officer's tone softens or sharpens, before your own instincts betray you. The phrase is simple, almost disarmingly polite, but it carries weight. I do not consent to any searches. You're going to hear that again and again, because everything in this situation revolves around whether you understand when to say it, how to say it, and what it actually does. Now picture this the way I've seen it hundreds of times. Red and blue lights behind you, your pulse rising faster than you want to admit, your brain trying to replay every possible mistake you might have made in the last 5 minutes. You pull over, the officer steps out. There's a moment where everything slows down and then tap, right on the taillight. Most people don't even notice it consciously. But that action serves a few purposes. One, historically, it was a way to leave a fingerprint on the vehicle, a small marker tying the officer to that stop. That matters less now with body cameras, but habits persist. Two, and more importantly in modern practice, it's a subtle psychological entry point. It's the officer announcing presence, asserting control, and beginning an interaction on their terms before a single word is spoken. Here's where this gets complicated. The law doesn't revolve around the tap itself. There's no statute that says, if the officer touches your taillight, X legal consequence follows. But what happens immediately after that moment is where people either protect themselves or quietly give away their rights without realizing it. Because the real battlefield in a traffic stop isn't the stop itself. It's consent. And consent doesn't look like what people think it does. It's not always a clear yes. It's often silence. It's often compliance. It's often a nervous laugh followed by, yeah, sure, go ahead. Now this is the part most people misunderstand. The Fourth Amendment protects you from unreasonable searches and seizures. That sounds strong. It sounds absolute. But in practice, it has a giant opening built into it, voluntary consent. If you give it, even casually, even under pressure, even when you don't fully understand what you're agreeing to, courts will often treat that consent as valid. So the moment that officer reaches your window and begins talking, everything shifts toward one quiet question. Will you assert your boundary, or will you let the interaction expand? This is the trap. It doesn't feel like a trap because it doesn't look aggressive. The officer might be friendly. They might ask simple questions. Where are you coming from? Where are you headed? You mind if I take a quick look in the vehicle? And it's phrased in a way that makes refusal feel awkward, almost suspicious. Let me be honest with you. That feeling, that hesitation, is exactly what the system relies on. Because once you say yes, or even signal yes through your behavior, the entire legal landscape changes. I've seen cases where a single line, yeah, I guess that's fine, became the foundation for a full vehicle search that uncovered something the driver never intended to reveal. And in court, when the defense tries to challenge it, the prosecution points to that moment and says, Your Honor, the defendant consented. And judges, more often than people expect, agree. So when that officer is standing at your window, after that subtle taillight tap has already set the tone, the most important thing you can do is anchor yourself to that phrase, I do not consent to any searches. Not aggressively, not sarcastically, calm, steady, clear. Because tone matters. Body language matters. Everything you do in that moment gets interpreted. Now, you might be thinking, if I say that, won't it make things worse? That's a fair question. And here's the hard truth most people don't want to hear. Yes, it might. This is where it turns. Asserting your rights is not a magic shield that makes the interaction end quickly or smoothly. In fact, sometimes it does the opposite. It can make the officer more suspicious. It can prolong the stop. It can lead to more questions, more scrutiny, even a K-9 unit being called to the scene. I've seen people assert their rights perfectly and still spend an extra 20 or 30 minutes on the side of the road while an officer tries to build independent probable cause. That's real. That happens. But here's the trade-off. Time and inconvenience on the roadside versus long-term legal exposure. One is temporary, The other can follow you for years. Now this is the part that requires nuance. Saying, "I do not consent to any searches," does not prevent an officer from searching your vehicle if they develop probable cause. If they claim they smell something, if they see something in plain view, if a canine alerts, the legal justification shifts. Your refusal doesn't override that. But your refusal does something critical. It preserves your legal position. It removes consent from the equation. It forces the officer to rely on actual legal grounds rather than your cooperation. And that difference can be everything in a courtroom. Let me give you a real-world style example, the kind I've seen variations of more times than I can count. A driver gets pulled over for a minor traffic violation. The officer approaches, taps the tail light, starts a conversation. The driver is polite, cooperative, a little nervous. The officer asks if there's anything illegal in the car. The driver says no. Then comes the question, "Mind if I take a look?" The driver hesitates, laughs nervously, and says, "Yeah, I guess." That "I guess" becomes consent. The search happens. Something is found. Maybe it's minor, maybe it's serious. But now the case revolves around whether that consent was voluntary. And in the vast majority of cases, courts say it was. Now imagine the same scenario, but the driver calmly says, "I do not consent to any searches." Everything changes. The officer can still investigate, they can still observe. But they've lost the easiest path forward. They have to build something more. And sometimes, they can't. Here's where psychology comes into play, and this is something people underestimate. Officers are trained not just in law, but in human behavior. They read hesitation, they notice eye movement. They pick up on tone shifts, and they understand that most people don't want confrontation. So the interaction often becomes a quiet negotiation, even if it doesn't feel like one. The officer applies subtle pressure, rephrasing questions, minimizing the request, making it sound routine. It'll just take a second. "If you've got nothing to hide, it's no big deal." That line, "if you've got nothing to hide," is one of the most effective psychological tools in the field. Because it reframes your refusal as suspicious, even though legally it isn't, and that's where people fold. This is why your delivery matters as much as your words. If your voice shakes, if your body language becomes defensive, if you start over-explaining, you unintentionally feed the narrative that something is wrong. Instead, you stay still. Hands visible, movements slow, voice steady. "I do not consent to any searches." No extra commentary, no justification, just the statement. Now, what if they ignore you? Because that happens too. There are situations where officers will proceed in a way that feels like they've brushed past your refusal. They might continue questioning. They might ask you to step out of the vehicle. They might start circling the car, looking for anything they can articulate later as probable cause. This is where people make a critical mistake. They escalate emotionally. They argue. They raise their voice. And in doing so, they create new problems that have nothing to do with the original stop. You have to understand something. The roadside is not the place where you win your case. That happens later, in a courtroom, where every word and action can be reviewed without the pressure of flashing lights and adrenaline. Your job in that moment is not to win. It's to avoid losing. So if they ignore your statement, you don't repeat it aggressively. You don't turn it into a confrontation. You maintain your composure. If asked again, you calmly restate it. "I do not consent to any searches," and then you let the situation play out. Because if a line gets crossed, if a search happens without proper legal basis, your calm, consistent refusal becomes part of the record. It becomes something a defense attorney can use. Something that can be pointed to and said, "There was no consent here." Now let's talk about adrenaline, because this is the invisible factor that affects everything. When those lights go on behind you, your body doesn't respond like it's a routine interaction. It responds like it's under threat. Heart rate spikes, fine motor skills drop. Your ability to think clearly narrows. That's why people say things they didn't mean to say. Agree to things they didn't intend to agree to. Forget what they know. And that's why rehearsing matters. Not memorizing in a robotic way, but internalizing to the point where the phrase comes out automatically, even when your mind is racing. "I do not consent to any searches." You don't want to be constructing that sentence in the moment. You want it ready. Now, let me be clear about something else. This is not about antagonizing law enforcement. This is not about turning every stop into a standoff. Most traffic stops end without incident. Most officers are doing their job within the bounds of the law. But the system itself is built in a way where your rights depend on your ability to assert them. And if you don't, the system doesn't pause and correct itself on your behalf. That's the reality. And here's where people sometimes get it wrong in the other direction. They think asserting their rights means being hostile, being combative, refusing to answer anything, creating tension from the start. That's not strategy. That's escalation. You can be respectful. You can provide required documents. You can comply with lawful orders. And at the same time, you can protect your boundaries. Those things are not mutually exclusive. Now, this is the part most people don't want to think about. Even if you do everything right, even if you stay calm, assert your rights clearly, and handle the interaction perfectly, you might still end up in a situation where your vehicle is searched, because officers can and do rely on other justifications. Probable cause is a flexible concept in practice. Observations, interpretations, even claims that are difficult to challenge in the moment can be used to justify further action. That doesn't mean your effort was pointless. It means you've preserved the ability to challenge it later. And that's where cases are actually decided. I've seen evidence suppressed because the initial interaction didn't support the officer's later claims. I've seen cases fall apart because the defendant's refusal to consent created a gap the prosecution couldn't fill. And I've also seen the opposite. Cases that looked questionable at first glance become airtight because the defendant casually agreed to a search that didn't have to happen. So when you hear that tap on your taillight, don't treat it like background noise. Treat it like the opening move in a sequence that can go in very different directions depending on what you do next. Stay grounded, stay aware, and when the moment comes, and it will come more often than people think, anchor yourself to the phrase that keeps showing up in every version of this story. I do not consent to any searches. Say it calmly, say it clearly, say it without apology. Because in that one sentence, you're doing something most people don't realize they have to do. You're drawing a line that the law recognizes, even if the moment itself feels uncertain. And the difference between people who regret what happened during a traffic stop and those who don't often comes down to whether that line was ever drawn at all. So don't wait until you're sitting on the side of the road with your heart pounding and your thoughts scattered. Don't assume you'll figure it out in the moment. Rehearse it, quietly, repeatedly, until it feels natural. I do not consent to any searches. Because when that taillight gets tapped and the conversation begins, you won't have time to think your way through it. You'll only have time to respond.